A very good afternoon to those of you in Europe. And on behalf of Michael Keating and myself, we are delighted to have you there with us. Berghof and EIP are sister organizations and mainly involved in conflict, but also deeply committed to environmental issues. And we are working together to see how we can align those sets of issues more. Now, in preparation for this meeting, I tried to do some historical research into water wars, but I was able to find only one war that was ever explicitly started over water, and that was 4,500 years ago. So one may be forgiven for thinking that, given that since the time of Abraham, there have been fewer wars fought about water than there have been about football matches. For example, the Honduras-Salvador War, 1969. One could be forgiven for thinking, why are we banging on so much about water security? Well, the reason is because water does represent an absolutely profound threat to future peace and security. And that has been growing in recent years. And the combination of climate change and massive population growth, particularly in arid areas, has made this the case. Yemen is a country that both Berghof and EIP are very, very committed to. It's a major priority for us both. And there's no way that we can probably get peace and security there until both the war is resolved and also the water sets of issues. As early as 1979, President Sadat was saying that if Egypt was ever involved in a future war, it would almost certainly be about water. And indeed, a series of UN Secretary Generals from Boutros-Ghali onwards have, rightly in my view, warned about the dangers of water conflict. Conflicts are frequently about resources and almost invariably about human rights. And sometimes the combination of the two. Wars are provoked by the rights to resources, or the inequitable sharing of resources. But this isn't the topic for today. We want to talk about not so much as to why water is a potential threat, but how it could actually be a potential door opener to mediators and to peacemakers. During today's discussion, I hope participants will use the Q&A function that you will find at the bottom of your screen. As often in these events, we run out of time and not all questions can be answered. But in any case, we will answer as many as possible. They will be filtered through moderator and fed to the panelists. I am actually delighted to present to you as a keynote speaker, Sava, now the Undersecretary, was the Ambassador of Finland to the United Nations and is now the Undersecretary for Foreign Policy and Security. He is a formidable presence, not only in the halls of power, but also on the ice hockey rink. And it is a great pleasure to have him. Kai, thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Berghof and EIP. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me to share some experiences from the Finnish perspective of the water diplomacy and water mediation. You really done your research, Andrew. That reference to the hockey sort of knocked me off the couch here, but there's a water connection as well, since in the early days when the winters were still cold in Finland, we had a lot of natural ice, and every kid practiced hockey on the hockey rink, which was actually frozen water. Now it's all artificial, but back in the days it was all kind of organic. It's also good to see old friends, Robert from the International Committee of Red Cross, and Also Alex Rondos, who I know he's very busy in the Horn of Africa, actually trying to solve a water-related potential conflict. So as you said, Andrew, water is quite essential in many ways. It's a fundamental to human life and ecosystems. It is 60% of our body is water. It is essential for our food security, and it can be essential for our energy production, transportation, etc., etc. So although, Andrew, you said it has so far caused only one war, it definitely has the potential to trigger more conflicts. But at the same time, it can also be a powerful motivation for peace and cooperation. Then, dear friends, we all know that climate change is a threat multiplier for international peace and security. And this change plays either a direct or indirect role will increase in the future. This is because, together with other effects of climate change, such as environmental degradation and the loss of biodiversity, there's a growing concern for deterioration of the world's water resources and ecosystems. As the threat of water scarcity spreads, tensions and conflicts over access to and use of water are on the rise. The current situation of the Nile is a good example. Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia are in negotiations on the major dam construction in Ethiopia, as countries and within the countries are increasing. At the same time, in some cases, it can be argued that the real problem
Sauer, please, can you unmute yourself?
So I guess this would constitute the second category of countries which never go to war with each other. The first one being the democracies, or full-fledged democracies. Transboundary lake and river basins account for an estimated 60% of global freshwater flow and are home to 40% of the world's population. This should be seen as an opportunity for cooperation between and among neighboring countries. Water has the potential to play an important geopolitical role, as it is the only natural resource that crosses country borders in a concrete and easily manageable and measurable manner. There are several ways in which improved transboundary water management arrangements may bring about benefits for people living within shared water basins. To name one, more equitable and efficient water sharing amongst farmers across borders can lead to more sustainable water use and more secure yields. Friends, the concept of water diplomacy has gained increasing international prominence over the past years. In 2018, the Council of the European Union adopted Council conclusions on water diplomacy. It is also discussed at multilateral fora such as the United Nations, the OSCE, and the African Union, identified as one of the areas that could be further developed as part of proactive and preventive mediation. Water for peace is the third pillar of the Finnish water strategy, which was launched in 2018. And the newly established Center for Peace Mediation at the Foreign Ministry has set water diplomacy as one of its key priorities. To further strengthen our water diplomacy, we have established a water diplomacy network together with the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry and the Ministry of Environment. This multi-skilled group actors can provide support to water-related processes by ensuring the relevant actors in both peace mediation and water sector are reached. This network is yet another example of how we can bridge different ministries, institutions, and civil society organizations to work. I guess in the diplomatic jargon that this would be called like multi-stakeholder coordination or interagency coordination. Anyway, our experience of this coordination work has been positive. Internationally, Finland has been an active player in the development of international agreements on transboundary water management since the 1960s. Our own transboundary water cooperation has also proved to be quite effective. And this might surprise you, but the Finnish-Russian transboundary water cooperation has been recognized as one of the best in the world. This was certified by an independent international study. The Finnish-Russian agreement on the utilization of transboundary water courses was signed in 1964 and is still functional after nearly 60 years. It sets out the principles for the use of transboundary rivers and lakes shared by the two states, and the good cooperation is maintained through constant collaboration related to the use, the management, and protection of the waters. The agreement is in line with contemporary principles. First, it covers all water crossing the border, and second, it is of comprehensive nature, concerning all relevant issues such as discharge management, flood and drought control, water quality and fish migration, data and information exchange, and even potential consequences for public health and economy. River Vuoksi, V-U-O-K-S-I, Vuoksi, one of the biggest river basins along the common border with Russia, has important hydropower dams in both countries, and their regulation capacity is crucial for flood and drought control. And the transboundary water agreement between the two countries includes clear trade-off analysis and compensation mechanisms that run both ways. Ever since, Finland has played quite an active role in global transboundary water issues by supporting the development of common legal framework and institutional development, and by transboundary water cooperation in the Nile Basin, Mekong region, and Central Asia. We have had a key role in establishing, and we are party to, both global conventions on transboundary waters, the 1992 UNECE Water Convention, so-called Helsinki Convention, and the UN Convention on the Law of Non-Navigational Uses of International New York Water Courses Convention from 1997. Our wider experience shows that the effective and equitable governance of shared natural resources and fairer distribution of the joint economic, social, and political benefits from the use of those resources among communities, regions, and countries can effectively prevent conflicts at all levels and are tokens of sustainable peace. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, peace mediation, conflict prevention, and peace building are priorities of Finnish foreign policy. Our approach to mediation is holistic. It emphasizes inclusivity and partnerships. It covers conflict prevention and promotion of national dialogues, as well as participation of women and youth in peace processes. As conflicts are becoming more complex and multidimensional, we underline the importance of coordination between peace building, humanitarian assistance and development cooperation, and the support of mediation activities in multilateral fora. Currently, we are looking for ways to increase our participation in different mediation and dialogue processes related to water. We are reinforcing our capacity in our water diplomacy network, and we are intensifying our network with relevant Finnish and international partners and building on our strengths. So this webinar is a great tool and example of what this outreach can be. I'm looking forward to a good discussion and further cooperation with all of you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Kai, for laying out the issues and also bringing to bear Finland's tremendous expertise that it has built up over the years on this topic. So now back to our co-convener, Michael Keating, head of the European Institute of Peace. Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And let me begin by saying happy 50th birthday to Berghof. I know this is one of the events you're organizing to celebrate that. So many congratulations. And we are really delighted to be co-hosting this with you. And let me thank Kai too for what he has said. And it is great to know that Finland is actively looking for ways to increase its involvement in disputes that involve water and bring its commitment and experience to bear, because I suspect that's going to be increasingly valuable in the years ahead. My job is to moderate the conversation over the next hour. And what we are going to do is hear from Nada Majdalani, who is the director of the Palestine office of EcoPeace Middle East. She will speak to us for up to 10 minutes. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with three very distinguished speakers, all of whom I've had the privilege of knowing for many years. One is Robert Mardini, the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Great to have you with us, Robert. I know how busy you have to be right now. I almost feel guilty that we're taking up your time, but it's a measure of how much importance you attach to this, that you've accepted this invitation, so thank you. Secondly, Habiba Sarabi, who I've also known for many years. I first met her when she was governor of Bamiyan province in Afghanistan, but she is an environmental advocate and has been recognized for her work on environmental issues. She is also one of the few female members of the Republic of Afghanistan's negotiating teams right now, engaging in talks, intra-Afghan negotiations with the Taliban. So again, Habiba, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us. And then we have Alex Rondos, the EU Special Representative to the Horn of Africa, who has vast experience around the world and most recently in the Horn, which I suspect everybody in this call knows is facing a very serious set of issues, many of which in one way or other do relate to access, management and control of water resources. So that discussion, the moderated discussion, and as Andrew said, my job will be to be receiving questions from the floor and putting them to the speaker, to each of the panelists. I'll give each of the panelists 3 or 4 minutes each, no more, just to kick off their remarks, and then I hope we'll have a very lively discussion. I'm not going to talk about water and conflict because Kai has done that, Andrew's done that, and I know Nada has done that. But I have to say, I am positively impressed to hear that the story of water is actually quite a good one in terms of conflict management. But I suspect that in the coming years, we are going to see enormous pressure put on water resources, even though the planet is 70% watery. As I think everyone knows, only 2% of that is fresh water, and much of that is inaccessible, poorly and inequitably managed and distributed, and is in increasing demand as a result of the things that have been talked about: population growth, changing temperatures, and so on. And water is also being used increasingly in conflict despite international law, with devastating humanitarian consequences. So I guess what we really want to do in this webinar is look at how the positive experiences are relevant to many of the problems coming down the track right now. What are the ways in which that experience can be used and deployed, and what are the entry points, not just in managing disputes that are patently over water themselves, but whether common interest in water management can be used as an entry point for dialogue between communities, between countries, and in regions that have many other political problems. I mean, can water actually help reframe some of the issues? And I can't resist, just before passing over to Nada, to say that the Institute has done a study, which I think one of my colleagues, I hope, can put on the chat, entitled Making Peace with the Climate, which looks at conflict resolution and the entry points that an understanding of environmental degradation and climate change afford. And the purpose of today is to zero in on the water aspect of that. So let me turn now to Nada before we have our panel discussion. Nada, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you for Berghof Foundation for this kind invitation. This is Nada Majdalani. I'm the Palestinian Director of EcoPeace Middle East, and those who are not familiar with our organization, we are a 26-year-old environmental peacebuilding organization that is focused on Jordan, Palestine, and Israel, with 3 offices equally operating in these countries. And throughout the presentation, you would basically understand further what we're trying to do and what we've been doing over the past 26 years. I'm going to start sharing my screen, which I cannot do. Can you please enable me to share my screen for the presentation? Okay, thank you. Okay, so basically what we are trying to propose as an organization starting December 2020 is a new concept for the Middle East, which is a green-blue deal for Palestine, Israel, and Jordan, which could basically extend towards other areas of conflict and other basins in the Middle East, such as the Nile and Tigris and Euphrates, and potentially also build on the new geopolitical dynamics of also the agreements between Palestine, between Israel and the Gulf countries, and also building on several new developments. Basically, the European New Deal, Green Deal, which is targeting until 2050 to convert Europe into a climate pioneering continent, and also with the new climate deal, which comes with the new Biden administration in the US. So in December, we have released this new report and concept, which is the Green-Blue Deal in the Middle East. And we've had several champions from around the world to speak at our event at that day, including also His Excellency Pekka Haavisto, the Foreign Minister of Finland, who also we are very grateful for him for his championship on our concept and what we're trying to do here in the region. Why we're thinking about this is because exactly of what Kai has mentioned in terms of how regions and how think tanks look at regions of conflict where there's water scarcity as as climate change as a threat multiplier. We have here the areas where they have water scarcity in the Middle East and where basically conflicts are concentrated, and we see somehow the correlation. In comparison to other countries of the world and other regions of the world, the Middle East is expected from now until the end of the century to deal with a 4 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, in comparison to only 1 Celsius to 2 Celsius in other regions of the world. This in water scarce areas is just a recipe for disaster, and is also what we said is a potential threat multiplier. How does this correspond to the water quantities and precipitation? We would see also from now until the end of the century a shift in precipitation. We're going to deal with 30 to 40% of decreased precipitation in the region, and winter seasons will be shorter until the end of the century, as we can see here from a study that is published by the Tel Aviv University. However, if we think of climate change as a threat multiplier and it has consequences on the region, we would like also to see how the region is interconnected, and how if impacts of climate change are happening on one side that potentially can be climate resilient resilient to climate impacts, the other countries that are surrounding can still be struggling from climate impacts, and yet correspond to the overall instability of the region. And this is clear from the example that I'm showing here, which is the Gaza Strip here in this side, and the Israeli communities here on this side. What you see in the picture is basically this red line is raw sewage from Gaza because of consecutive years of blockade on Gaza and the inability of the authorities in Gaza to develop wastewater treatment plants to treat the sewage of 2 million people, and also to receive electricity and energy that is necessary to basically operate these plants. What is happening is actually over the past years that sewage is being dumped raw into the Mediterranean and contributing to the pollution of Israeli beaches and the closure of large desalination plants, one of them which contributes to around 20% of the drinking water of Israel. This shows the interconnectedness of environmental impacts, and that environment and water do not recognize political boundaries. And regardless of how much basically Israel is capable at this stage with the booming of technology of desalination to protect itself from the impacts of climate change, the insecurity of its neighbors, and particularly Palestine and Jordan, will still have repercussions on Israel's water security and security overall. And here's why we come and we propose 4 main pillars for the Green-Blue Deal for the Middle East. The first pillar is basically an exchange of energy and water between Palestine, Israel, and Jordan, where Jordan has the comparative advantage to produce large quantities of solar energy on its side. However, where it can also be able to, that also Israel and Gaza can produce desalinated water from the Mediterranean. And this exchange would create basically geopolitical benefits, which create interdependencies between the 3 countries. This is very similar to basically the proposal and the agreement of the coal and steel, which brought out the European Union from the ashes of World War II. What we are aiming for is to basically utilize the most precious resources of our region, which are the sun and the sea. And with that, basically, we are capitalizing on what Israel is currently able to do and planning in terms of increasing its capacity in desalination, which is going to be doubled until 2050 or tripled even. And in that sense, it makes more sense that the water security of the nations surrounding Israel needs to also be thought of, because I see it as the Titanic. You cannot, once the iceberg hits, or once climate change hits the region, it will not be able to differentiate who is more capable to deal with climate change issues and who is not. And while Israel is enjoying its water security, the Palestinians and Jordanians are struggling with their water security. And this middle picture right in the middle is from Gaza, where 2 million people are basically not able to drink the water under their feet for several reasons, partly because of overpumping and partly because of the also Israeli restrictions where they cannot get enough water. Similarly, also, there's a lot of pressure on water resources on the Jordanian side. Also, we have issues with transboundary streams and polluted transboundary streams between Israel and Jordan and Palestine. And we have several issues that are relevant to the mismanagement of these transboundary streams, and no agreements that are governing how to deal with them and how to treat the sewage and how to basically also deal with the cost of treating the sewage on these streams. This puts us in the second pillar, which is very important in our Green-Blue Deal, which is a shift in the paradigm where the thinking and the that was in 25 years ago when Oslo Agreement was signed between the Palestinians and Israelis is not relevant anymore, particularly that the water issue was held hostage with the other 5 final status issues, which are very much difficult. And what we're looking at basically in the Green-Blue Deal is to capitalize on some of the ideas that we're talking about in terms of the new developments in water technology from non-conventional resources and the exchanges and water diplomacy tracks in order for Palestinians to gain their fair share and water rights, but also to utilize water diplomacy and gaining basically and putting the parties around the table to discuss water issues, which are now the low-hanging fruit, is potentially also a trust building measure and a measure to basically test the goodwill of both sides to actually discuss the more other difficult issues. The other fourth element is basically the Jordan River Basin, and the Jordan River is basically demised also because it's of course a shared water course. It's affecting the Dead Sea, of course, that is somehow also a world wonder. It's the demise of the Jordan River is mostly created because of the political conflict, but also because of climate change. What we are proposing basically is a regional master plan that focuses on infrastructure on several sectors that are relevant to climate change, resilience, and adaptation, including in the water sector, sanitation, renewable energy, and agricultural innovation, which would shift basically the economic situation of the valley, particularly on the Jordanian and Palestinian side, from a $4 billion economy to a $73 billion economy by 2050. And this requires a lot of cooperation and understanding and knowledge exchange and know-how. And the final pillar of basically the Green-Blue Deal is education and awareness and working with the communities. We work with youth, and our target for the past 4 years is to reach out to 22,000 youth from the 3 countries to teach them about their water reality and their neighbors' water reality. And of course, also here on the right side, this is a photo of mayors from Palestine, Israel, and Jordan jumping into the Jordan River and telling their leadership and politicians that they are all wanting to basically address the water issues and the climate change issues collectively and cooperatively. This is how we capitalize basically on the base of our communities to actually also amplify their voices and amplify our message. Throughout all this work that we've done over the 26 years, we also capitalize on the international community interest and support. My colleagues and we addressed the Security Council back in 2019, and we spoke about the very heart of these issues. We also have, and we're very thankful to His Excellency Pekka Haavisto, Finnish Foreign Minister, who also is championing our Green-Blue deal. Once he actually gave a keynote in our regional conference in 2020. I would like to stop here because I don't want to take much of our time, but basically what we are proposing is not at all different from what we actually are trying to do on the ground. We keep communicating and engaging with our stakeholders, with our communities, to basically amplify our message in terms of climate security and utilizing climate change not as a threat multiplier, but actually as an opportunity multiplier for our region. Thank you so much. I'll give the floor again to Michael and the colleagues.
Thank you very much, Nada. So now I think I'm going to ask the panelists to join us. That is Robert, Alex, and Habiba. Not quite sure how this is going to work visually. A number of things jumped out at me from what you said, Nada, from a kind of political perspective. First of all, the point that you made is that getting water management right increases economic opportunity for everyone. And it seems to me that's a very powerful argument, but I don't know whether it is a killer argument in terms of moving things forward. It also made me wonder what you said, the degree to which conversations about water are positively influencing broader political discussions, and whether that would be relevant in other parts of the world. And I was also intrigued by the photo of all the mayors sitting in the pool. I noticed they didn't have water pistols, which I suppose is a good thing. But it did make me wonder whether, you know, the best way to try and encourage dialogue around water is at that level, at the municipal level, at the local level, rather than at the national level. Anyway, we'll come back to many of these points. I'm now going to turn to Robert, and I don't know, Robert, if there's anything that Nada said that you want to pick up on. But clearly, the thing that I would like to know from you is, you know, you have been on record very articulate about how water is being used by parties to conflict, to disable each other, to as being targeted. Is this getting worse? Are there trends that we are witnessing? And you know, do you agree with the thesis that seems to be emerging already from this discussion that water can actually be a positive force for good, maybe even in humanitarian crises and conflict situations? Over to you, Robert. You're on mute.
Yes. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Nada, and thank you, Andrew, for having me. And great to see my good friend Kai, who was always a very strong advocate of international humanitarian law in New York. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Nada, for giving us insight into the very interesting work of your organization. It really reminded me of my times at ICRC as a water engineer, where we were trying to solve the wicked problem of the sewage in the Gaza Strip. And clearly with the growth of population, the declining of water table, higher salinity, it's still a work in progress and much more needs to be done. So maybe if I can kick off with the fact that from our practice, climate change is not a direct cause for conflict, but in the absence of institutions able to mediate tensions and manage resources equitably, climate risk and environmental degradation may further fuel local tensions and instability and contribute to shaping dynamics of violence. We see this materializing and happening in Africa, in the Middle East, and in many places we work. In some places, the actions of armed groups are such as deforestation or illegal mining cause environmental degradation that in turn make people more vulnerable and inflame local tensions. So the ICRC's approach in a nutshell is to help conflict and violence affected communities become more resilient to environmental degradation and successive climate shocks, to better understand how these risks affect the communities with whom we work and how we can best support them. We conducted research for over a year in 3 contexts, Northern Mali, Central African Republic, and Southern Iraq. So simply put, in each of these contexts, we found that combined climate risk and conflict really disrupt all aspects of people's life. And this is true of their safety and health, their food, their water, and economic security. Effects can be felt regionally or across borders, impacting migration and access to resources. So what can be done? Of course, we need concerted global efforts to limit climate change and avoid the worst effects for people and their environment. But at the same time, we urgently need to find ways to help people and communities adapt. We need to help build resilient communities alongside effort to protect those communities from violence. So in the Middle East, for instance, where water scarcity can be particularly acute, we have done a long way in successfully adapting our water-related activities. So in places like Yemen, for example, we have progressively focused more on improving the management of water resources rather than digging for more water, which only exacerbates water threat. In places like Sava, you have a declining of the water table by 6 meters per year. So clearly, given the scale of the challenge, we need to work in partnership within and beyond the humanitarian sector. We also need to mobilize those who are best placed to ensure that climate action and finance reach communities affected by conflict. And it is also a call for improving the implementation of the international humanitarian law rules protecting the natural environment during armed conflict. So greater respect for these rules would help limit environmental degradation and in turn reduce the climate risk that conflict-affected communities face. So now, Michael, to your question, is water being targeted by parties to conflict and is this getting worse? What we're seeing at ICRC is a troubling trend, actually, in which water, sanitation, and energy infrastructure is being destroyed either through deliberate targeting or as a result of incidental damage, as well as in some instances, water infrastructure being used as a political or military tool to achieve a particular political or military objective. So using access to water as a tactic during conflict or targeting water, wastewater, or energy facilities creates immediate and long-term negative impacts on public health for already very vulnerable populations. The humanitarian consequences from such incidents also pose a risk for displacement, reduced livelihood, and on the environment. So the urbanization of armed conflict is an undisputable trend also that we see. And when war moves to cities and other populated areas where civilians and combatants, civilian objects and military objectives are frequently intermingled or in close proximity, the risk of critical civilian infrastructure such as water, pumping stations, or treatment plants damaged or destroyed is multiplied, especially when explosive weapons with wide area effects are used, which unfortunately is becoming the norms in places like Syria, Yemen, the Central African Republic, and elsewhere. So we are also witnessing incidents where essential services are misused. So parties to the conflict that have an ambition to control territory and govern over a population may opt not to destroy infrastructure, but rather shut off the service to deprive an entire population of access and to achieve a desired military or political advantage. This then allows them to turn the service back on after the hostilities have ended. So to ensuring the continuity in the delivery of essential services, this requires not only that civilian infrastructure is protected, but also that service provider personnel who operate, maintain, and repair the infrastructure and the consumables, which are often stored in warehouses, are also spared. So maybe I will leave it here.
Okay, thank you, Robert. That was very interesting and very relevant to our other speakers, and I'm going to come back to you on some of the, maybe they will, and some of our participants. But let me turn to Habiba now. Again, Governor, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. One of the most memorable experiences I had was going with you to a very remote community in Afghanistan to open an environmental peace park, which was about trying to bring people together who may have lots of differences, but recognized a common interest in management of environmental resources. So could I ask for some of your thoughts on this, in particular whether environmental and water management issues are used enough to promote dialogue, including parties that are at conflict with each other?
Thank you very much, Michael. Very good to see you visually, and my greeting and good evening to all the friends that watching us and following us. So let me to talk a little bit about the water management and our system or in our culture that you have been talked about and one of the remote area like Bamyan. So unfortunately now it's damaged, but because water is very fundamental, very vital for every person for life. So the people in Afghanistan, they recognized before that it is important. So they made a kind of traditionally manage among themselves. So one of the best management that they did it was the people called Mirau. Mirau means that the person that he is the not very elder of the village, but someone that he was able to manage how to distribute water among the population, because they are not facing with the shortage of water. But because of conflict, because of war, unfortunately, this traditional management, this traditional system is damaged. So it is now, unfortunately, one of the biggest cause of conflict in the rural area. But of course, it will be an issue that after the peace agreement, because resource management and land management, these are something that we have to have a strategic plan, a clear policy for that, and a strategic plan for that that can be a part of the peace agreement, the peace dialogue, that how to manage that one. Now, at the moment, unfortunately, Taliban are not caring a lot about this water management and land management because it's war, it's conflict. They wanted to use as much they want to do it. But they are always thinking about ideology, how to fulfill their ideology to the population and to the government of Afghanistan. But anyway, this can be a big part of the dialogue, a big part of the peace deal for the resource management, land management, and water management. Otherwise, this century is the century, or will be the century of shortage of water. So if that cannot be a part of the peace deal and the dialogue, of course, after the peace deal, the Afghan people will face, and the government after peace will face a big problem with the shortage of water. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. And you've made two, to my mind, fundamental points. One is that in many societies, governance arrangements are actually built around the management and use of water. And Robert was talking about the absence of institutions, and I would like to suggest that includes the absence of local governance arrangements. They have been destroyed, and many of them were rooted in water management itself. The second thing you've said is that unless these issues are part of the peace agreement between the Taliban and the Republic of Afghanistan, then that peace agreement is going to be deeply imperfect and incomplete. And yet they are not being discussed. So to my mind, that only, I think, reinforces the notion that water needs to be more centrally included in political discussions and in peace agreements. And it does beg the question as to whether that is possible and realistic, given how focused many of the parties to conflict are on power and on security. They're not really thinking about these things. Now, let me turn to Alex, who, as ever, is on the move. He is always on the move, and he is literally on the move right now. I imagine, Alex, that some of the points that have been made by the previous speakers resonate with you as you think about what's happening in the whole. So I'd love to hear what you have to say. In particular, the significance of water to relationships between some of the key actors in the Horn itself.
Michael, thank you. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes, we can.
Good.
See you. Yeah.
I'm going to the car will park shortly because I fear I'll lose some signal in a minute. Now, thank you very much for having me on this, and I feel rather humbled, frankly, because I'm surrounded by real expertise, and I can only offer some perspectives from my perch, which is a much more political one, I guess. Here are two or three thoughts. I'm involved directly in the discussions on the Nile and the dam, and I don't want to take you into the details of that, but I must say there is an astonishing sort of resonance in what I'm confronted by as an unresolved issue with what Nada was describing in the situation there in the region, in the Middle East, and especially with Palestine, Israel, and the like. Now, two or three points I'd like to make fairly briefly for now. First, that I'm struck by one thing, that in the Horn of Africa, we're really dealing with a single sole source of water. That is the highlands of Ethiopia, from which all the rivers rise and then descend. This is the Blue Nile, the Shabelle River into Somalia, the Omo heading down into Kenya. And I think people often forget the degree to which there's this single source, as it were, which has a direct impact on all these countries and huge populations. Second, I worry that very often, and I think this speaks to the core of the question that is at the heart of this discussion, there's a real danger that the water issues, whether it is dams or the accessibility of water as it descends, either into Sudan and Egypt or Kenya or Somalia, in a region where so much of the politics among the countries consists of how you use a deterrent, meaning how do you protect your neighbors, how do you look after your neighbor's dissident as a deterrent against your neighbor. When you get into complicated relationships, you will find that various assets are put to use. And one of my worries right now in the Horn is that water can be used as a threat to neighbors. And we've got to find a way of turning this on its head. I hope I'm not speaking. I hope this can be treated with the necessary confidence. But I do worry that the relationship between Sudan and Ethiopia today, the issue of the Nile and the Gerd will be seen as just one of issues in a basket of an increasingly complicated relationship between two countries. And that's a bit like pressing a nuclear button when you do that. That is what we really have to address. The Somalia and Kenya, I think it'll be an easier issue to deal with. So there is an absolute fundamental need right now, as we speak, that the international community, for example, make absolutely clear that you cannot take the politics that surrounds the construction of a dam and the subsequent flow of a river into something that is going to be used as a tool or a threat within a wider negotiation between two countries. If we don't start homing in on that question, we will have a heap of trouble down the road. Secondly, I find dealing with the Nile, it's absolutely fascinating, because here I want to try to turn to what could be a more positive approach to things. It's a mix of how do you deal with law, hydrology, economics, and the clash of sovereignties. And it's how do we turn this into something more constructive. Now, in the Gerd, on the issue of the dam and the Blue Nile, I'm struck by the fact that we've all this all began backwards. If you step back and say, in an ideal world, you'd look at the Blue Nile and say, how do we turn this river, which is a finite resource, this is the fundamental point, if not a diminishing resource because of climate change, how do we make sure we flip things so that a population of some 250 million people who in one way or another are largely dependent on the way this water is used of the River Nile, whatever aquifers there might be, and these are barely touched. How do we turn this into the best economic opportunity for these countries? What are the trade-offs between them? To what extent can Ethiopia generate electricity and do so wisely and get into the regional power grids? How does Sudan take advantage of an extra harvest, but not misuse the extra water? Because in effect, the dam is producing water that replaces the oil revenue that Sudan lost when South Sudan became independent. How does Egypt achieve water security in such a way that it begins to gradually shift strategically over a period the use of its own water to minimize the degree to which it is dependent on the Nile? Because right now, the narrative is everyone sees the Nile as the panacea. And my sense is this ain't going to last long enough for that. So my own suggestion would be it's time for the IFIs and everyone, and it goes right down to local communities, to look at what is the grand package that will actually match generation of electricity and energy, proper irrigation, and proper water security. And this involves high-level politics, but at the same time, the willingness not to deal with this piecemeal, but look at how we take this as an entire zone and region, a base, and then ask ourselves, what is the real opportunity for economic development related to the flow of this river? And how do we not diminish what water there is? And how do we diversify the economics? That, to my mind, is the way one can begin to incentivize a discussion which at the moment is dancing on a pinhead, which is how should one manage the flow from a single dam? And but I think this is the only way we can begin to move forward. Thank you, and over back to you.
Thank you very much. And, you know, it does beg the question, Alex, as to whether there is anything like the level of interstate cooperation that NADA set out that would allow, you know, a consideration of these issues. And it's almost just I don't know if you have the answer to this. I mean, are people from Ethiopia and Sudan and Egypt and Somalia and, you know, other countries talking to each other about these issues? You know, even before you get to any kind of political agreement, I mean, to what degree are they being encouraged and supported to think of water not as a zero-sum game, but as a resource that can grow the pie for everyone and that can create economic opportunities for everyone? And if, you know, it is the case that there are some very clever analysts doing this, well, that's great, but to what degree is it being socialized in political discussions? And what needs to happen, you know, what can be done to make sure that happens? So I'd like to come back to you on that. In the meantime, there's lots of questions coming in. There's one, I'm going to turn to Robert. There's one for Robert first from Ollie Brown, which is that given that armed groups are targeting water sources, do you think that peacekeeping operations should be given a mandate by the UN Security Council to protect water resource infrastructure where this is taking place? Robert.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for the question. The problem is there are so many instances where this is happening, given the fragmentation of armed conflict, the number of armed groups, and the probability to have this type of incident, that I'm afraid that the Security Council won't be able to give mandate to new peacekeeping forces to do this exclusively. Rather, I think for us, we continue to invest in the dialogue with all armed groups. And I think the only compass for this dialogue should be international humanitarian law. And actually, when there is a dialogue, this is more respected than other things in conflict. I mean, if we take places like Syria, I mean, we are all horrified by the devastation of now a decade of conflict in Syria, where we've seen hospitals being attacked and so forth. Water facilities have been more spared because at the end of the day, everyone needs water, and water in urban centers cross front lines. And you can engage with parties to the conflict, government, armed groups, and if you have a dialogue, you can make a point that this should not be attacked. It doesn't work every time, but it's important to maintain the pressure. And in internal conflict, which is the vast majority of conflict these days, parties think that this place will become under their control. So there is also a tactical incentive for them, maybe not to attack physically those water facilities. What happens, unfortunately, is the lack of maintenance, the lack of supplies, the lack of electricity, which is more targeted indeed, that makes it more challenging. Yeah, I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Well, that's very interesting. And I'm going to build on that to ask a question of Nada. And it comes from Wandra Kaufman. You know, and she points out, as has Robert in a way, that, you know, you can have conversations around water and perhaps they can be more productive than around other issues. But has it had any effect on cooperation in other areas between national governments? Is there any evidence in your case, for example, that relationships between Jordan, the Palestinian Authority, and of Israel have improved beyond the water management thing, or is this just a sort of boutique issue which everyone's agreed to deal with, but carry on squabbling over absolutely everything else?
Yeah. Well, definitely it's not as easy as it sounds. I mean, we can't just build a pink picture and assume that theoretically what we are talking about could actually, have a clear-cut influence on ground with all the other political tensions. I mean, we've had a long-term agreement between Israel and Jordan on water issues, which happened, of course, after the peace agreement between the two countries over the reservoir of the Lake of Galilee or Tabaraya lake, where the Jordanians have access to water from the lake during the summer season, and where Israel has to store water during the winter season. This type of water diplomacy then started as an example to also develop further when they started the talks about the Red Dead Canal. And then later, the Palestinian Party also chipped into the conversations in terms of how to develop such a water diplomacy concept into a larger regional cooperation and stability, security concept. However, as we moved forward with this process, it did have the political and geopolitical difficulties did actually influence and impact moving forward on actually the water diplomacy efforts. So most of the time in practice, it is vice versa. It's the geopolitical difficulties that is actually impacting and negatively influencing the efforts for water diplomacy. However, this doesn't mean that we cannot move forward with this track. I mean, when we look at, for example, the concept of eco-peace, to prioritize negotiating on water for Palestinians. When Palestinians and Israelis negotiated water 25 years ago in Oslo, and they put it as one of the 5 final status issues, along with refugees, with borders, with the illegal settlements, and with the question of East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, whatever. We had a major problem, which was we were negotiating over water that is from nature resources alone. Today, we have abundance of non-conventional water resources, which are mostly developed on the Israeli shores, but also with the high potential to be developed in the Gaza Strip. If also, again, the political will is pushed and the enabling environment is there. Right. If we tackle the water reallocation from nature resources and we tackle the Palestinian water rights in a negotiated matter, we envision that this potentially can be a tool and an instrument that can lead to discussing the other more difficult issues. So this is in theory, and it could happen in practice, because on a second level and on the technical level, the parties do recognize the need for cooperation. It just needs the political will and the leadership. And on the other hand, even the security establishment in Israel believes that and this is not my talk, this is the evidence that my colleague Gideon Bromberg, the Israeli director of EcoPeace, brings all the time, that the Israeli security establishment does recognize that the Palestinians need to have access to water and to stabilize their water security. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you. We only have, I'm just before we end in 20 minutes, I will be asking Suzanne Schmeyer, who's the Associate Professor in Water Law and Diplomacy, to give us some takeaways from this conversation. So I do want to try and pack in as much as possible in the next 10 minutes. And I have a question, one for Habiba and one for Alex, I'll give you both the questions. Habiba, the question is, in a way, it's from Laurie Cooper, who is asking, he's asking the panelists, but I'm asking you. I'm so sorry. It's from Christoph Lutzmann, who is from the Center for Integrative Mediation in Berlin, is whether there is any interaction between peace negotiators and technical experts on one team. So I guess the question for you, Habiba, is, are there any people who understand environment and water issues talking to the negotiation team in Doha, whether it's the Taliban or whether it's the Republic negotiation team? Are there any kind of sidebar discussions about the importance of these issues from people who understand them, presumably with a view to encouraging dialogue? And while you think about the answer, let me just tell Alex what the question for him is. And it's from Benjamin Paul of Adelphi, who says that the grand bargain sounds great, but this has been the objective of the Nile Basin Initiative for a couple of decades. Governments' incentives don't correspond to their countries' incentives. How can it be changed? How can governments be persuaded to pursue their interests rather than their positions? Let me start with Habiba. Any water or environmental technical experts enriching your discussions in Doha?
Thank you, Michael. You're working with us closely. We know each other, and also as an institute, European Institute for Peace, we have got several training programs by your team. But unfortunately, as I said, the environmental issue, the water management is not a priority for the Taliban. Taliban is mostly ideologically, they are fighting, so that's why they are not thinking about that. You know that the Taliban, they are not expert for many things, not for water, environment, neither for the science, and so that's why even among our technical team, unfortunately, there is no one that to be expert on the environmental issue, water management, and the other environmental issue. I think this is very, very necessary. This is vital to have someone, because after the peace agreement, these type of issue is something that we have to think about, that not only among the Afghans inside, but the water issue is with our neighboring country. At the moment, we have some dispute for the water management between the Afghan government and Iranian. So these are something that it should be, I mean, even because the negotiation and the peace process is not only among Afghan, this is a kind of regional dimension and regional interaction. So it is very necessary to have some expert on that to tackle with this water management dispute between the Afghan government and Iranian or other neighboring country, and among ourselves or among the Taliban and Afghan government at the same time. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And in a way, you're asking a question that's been put by someone called Iman Emir, who was asking about Iran and water. But you're saying that not only is there scope for negotiators to be briefed on these issues, but also to put this on the table when it comes to regional discussions to incentivize peace agreements. Alex, the question to you was, how can governments be persuaded to pursue their interests rather than just to repeat their political positions? Are you still with us?
I am. Michael, this is not an easy one. I've noticed in the course of these talks that actually, with some good sharing, people do shift from their positions to acknowledging their interests. I think what we have is a different problem here. I think at a technical level, even at a legal one, there can be solutions found. What we've discovered, though, is because of the situation in the region, which has become much more fraught, governments hide or rather become hostage to their own rhetoric, which in turn locks them in a corner from which it's more difficult to step out. Ethiopia, for example, will say, why should it surrender its sovereign right to develop water and water resources in the highlands? In other words, build more dams. And Egypt says, well, that will destroy the lives of, 100 million Egyptians. The moment this enters the political rhetoric, it's very, as we all know who've done politics, it's very difficult to walk back from that. And so we're at a stage right now, moment, the Congolese have taken over the chairing of the AU. In a few days, they will chair the first session, bringing the various parties together and those of us who are meant to be observers, and then but they're going to do something which is the first time since COVID began. Everyone is going to meet in person. And there's no doubt in my mind that it is meetings in person that are going to start changing the atmospherics. I've rarely found something less conducive to getting to people to move to discussing their real interests and doing that virtually. And so this crisis is victim to COVID in many ways, as well as just, some good degree of belligerence floating around at the moment. But if we can move it back to just quiet discussions where people can pull out and talk, this is practical stuff, I think we may be able to begin to find a way through. That to me is the major thing. If I may just go back to an earlier question that you had mentioned, the cooperation and institutions in the region. Yes, there are, but they're insufficient. It's as simple as that. The economic cooperation, the degrees of quality of legal advice among the countries is good, but I think there's much more work needed there. And then related to the last question, matching technical and legal expertise with, if you will, the mediation and the political practitioners is absolutely vital. Because it's in that sort of feedback that starts to occur that we begin to find answers to solutions. Left to us who do politics, we tend to toxify, technicians detoxify. And I found that's a real interesting lesson I've learned from this last year's discussions. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, we're running out of time, and I can see that Kai, you are still with us, at least my screen says you are. So I don't know if there's anything, Kai, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if there is anything you would like to jump in on this point, please just put your camera on and do so. If you don't, I'll assume you're just taking stock of the conversation that's taking place. Unfortunately, we really are. Kai, would you like to just jump in on anything you've heard? By the way, I think your opening remarks about Finland being willing to share its experience and network experience is so compelling and important. And that's one of the takeaways that I'm getting from this conversation. A question I have is the degree to which the knowledge of doing these things is being shared, and whether that's something you think deserves further investment.
Yes, well, thank you, Michael. Not much really to add. I've been impressed by the depth and comprehensiveness and diversity of this discussion, and also the experience and the concrete and practical examples the panelists and yourself have brought to the table. What I can only reiterate is that we are remaining on the subject and developing our own skills, and at the same time we will share our experience with the others, and I think this is a good way to go forward in partnership, and indeed relying on EIP and Berghof and driving this portfolio. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kai. There are other questions. Laurie Cooper, for example, has been asked a question about treating water runoff that's been made unusable by multinational corporations. And that's an extremely interesting question. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time to answer that, but we haven't, I'm grateful to her for bringing in the private sector dimension, because often, we come from intergovernmental organizations or non-governmental organizations, and we may be insufficiently attentive to the role of the private sector, both in complicating things and indeed in contributing to solutions. It is I think my job is coming to an end. I want to pass the floor now to Suzanne. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for agreeing to do some takeaway thoughts from us. Not an easy task, because this has been quite a free-wheeling and wide-ranging, and as Kai said, lots of interesting practical ideas. But tell us, what are you taking away from this conversation?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Michael. And as you say, it's indeed quite difficult to come to the one and only conclusion. So I'll focus on a few points. We started off discussing what the risks of water conflict or water war actually are. And I would agree here that not only have we not seen water wars in the past, except for that one really far in the past, I also think that we won't see them in the future, or that the likelihood of seeing water wars between states in the future is very low. However, that should not distract us from the fact that conflicts do happen below the threshold of war, even between states, and that have all sorts of negative repercussions on people's lives and livelihoods, on economic relations, trade relations, regional stability, and so on. But even more, we shouldn't be forgetting that a lot of conflict and violence that happens over water being the source of it, or water being a driving factor in it, happens at the subnational level. So where people are really suffering these days, and where we really see violence and lives being lost over water, is at the very local level, but increasingly also at the interprovincial level in federal states, for example. And Iran was mentioned by one of the people asking a question, and that's indeed one of the countries where we do see conflicts between different parts of the country over water. I think another important point that was made was about the role of governance capacity, or the role of institutions. And here I think is really where the core of the issue lies. It is the capacity of institutions to adapt to hydrological change, to economic change, and so on, that will determine whether increasing scarcity, increasing demand, and so on actually leads to conflict, to competition, and to violence or not. And I think that's exactly where the peacebuilding community and many other communities come in, and where also really the cooperation between the peacebuilding community and the water management community matters. Because if you want to build or strengthen institutions that are able to deal with increasing pressure on water resources, you need those that know about how to bring communities or users or conflicting parties together, and you need those that know how to actually manage water. And I think that's where we're still facing some challenges, to put it mildly. I'll come back to that in a second. I would like to pick up one other point that was mentioned. It's the chance or the need to include water and other natural resources in peace agreements and in negotiations over peace agreements. I think that's really a great idea. It's absolutely needed, but as Habiba mentioned, for the case of Afghanistan, and as is also the case for many other places around the world, it's not really happening. And there are reasons for it. I mean, peace is something, and the peacebuilding community needs to act for very good reasons quickly, and water managers tend to be a bit slower. If we talk about water cooperation and look at processes, how water cooperation has been built in the Rhine River Basin, for example, one that's known these days for really good cooperation, took 40 years to solve the problems there and not all are solved. And that's obviously not a time that peace can wait. So I think we have a bit of a gap here. I think another important point that was raised that is equally challenging, though, is to enlarge the basket of benefits. So to move beyond water, a bit along what Nada has presented, and bring in energy security, food security, and other things. And I think it's very well known in the water, maybe not so much in the peacebuilding community, that this is the way forward, moving beyond zero-sum water allocation towards a larger basket of benefit. But then that would also require that we do not only need to bring the peacebuilding and the water community together, but also the agricultural sector, the energy sector, and what other issues are important in the respective countries. So it's probably needed, or I'm absolutely sure it's needed to come to long-term sustainable and peaceful solutions, but it makes things even more complicated, I'd say. And of course, what was also mentioned by a number of people was the role of the international community. And I think that is my third point, that is equally crucial. So the international community really can make a difference. But what we see here is also that there's definitely room for improvement when it comes to coordination, be it between different UN agencies, those on the humanitarian side, those on the development and those on the environmental side, but equally also between local NGOs in a certain country that work on the peace side or on the water side, and how these can work together. And I think what's related and what is a very important question in this is, for the international community, does it work? So the international community will only engage in water-based peace building if it actually works. And there is this increasing pressure, and especially in times of COVID with limited resources, should we invest in something that actually makes sense and it delivers? And I just want to briefly mention the example of the Sava Basin in Southeastern Europe, which after the Yugoslav wars, where countries were basically at war, but water was selected as the first issue for them to cooperate on. And it worked. They signed an agreement over their river, and that has really triggered cooperation way beyond. So I think to finish with this rather positive note, I think there's a really great potential to bring together water managers, peace builders, and others to use water as a resource for peace. But it does require that we do work together, learn to speak each other's language, which I think is still a bit of a challenge, and learn to also work along the different timelines that we have, the different financial streams that we have, and so on. But I do think that ultimately, water managers working with peace building organizations and vice versa is the only way forward. And I hope today's event contributed to that. So thanks a lot, and over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. My last task is to ask Habiba and Kai and Alex to put their cameras on, because I gather the organizers would like to take a photo if we can, and others. And Alex is there. That would be great. So snap away, whoever's taking photographs. Andrew. I would like, I think Andrew's going to do this, but just in case he forgets, thank you so much, all of you, for your terrific contributions. Over to you, Andrew, and thank you, Suzanne, for such a great, flyby of the main points that came out of this. Very, very useful. Andrew, back to you.
No, nothing from me. Just a big thanks to you, Michael, and all of our guests. It's been a really great event. Many, many thanks.
Okay, thank you all so much. Have a good evening, good lunch, good morning, wherever you are. Most grateful to you. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.